I was 58 years old when I finally understood what my boss really thought of me. It happened in the most unexpected way, during a conference room meeting that was supposed to seal the biggest deal of my career. My name is Margaret, and I had worked at Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago, for nearly 12 years. I started as an administrative assistant when I was 46, fresh from a divorce that had left me scrambling to rebuild my life. Over the years, through night classes and sheer determination, I had worked my way up to senior client relations manager. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My boss, Richard Henderson, was the founder's son. He was 42, Harvard-educated, and had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. When his father retired 3 years ago, Richard took over as CEO. That's when things started to change. At first, it was small things. Richard would schedule meetings without inviting me, even though I managed the client relationships he was discussing. He'd ask me to prepare detailed reports, then present them as his own ideas. When I tried to speak up in meetings, he'd talk over me or check his phone with exaggerated disinterest. But I needed this job. At my age, starting over wasn't an option. I had a mortgage, my mother's nursing home bills, and my daughter's student loans to help with. So I kept my head down and worked harder, hoping that excellence would speak for itself. It never did. The real problem started 6 months ago when Richard announced we were pursuing a major partnership with Beaumont Industries, a French manufacturing company looking to expand into the American market. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward for years. I had the relationships, the expertise, the track record, but Richard made it clear from the beginning that he would be leading this initiative personally. Still, I was assigned to the project team. I spent months researching Beaumont's operations, analyzing market data, developing strategy proposals. I worked late into the night, sacrificing weekends and holidays. I poured everything I had into making this partnership succeed. But every time I contributed an idea, Richard would dismiss it. Every report I wrote, he'd have his assistant rework with minimal changes, then present it under his name. In team meetings, he'd interrupt me mid-sentence, or suggest we move on whenever I tried to speak. The other team members noticed. I could see it in their sympathetic glances, their awkward silences, but no one said anything. Richard was the CEO, after all. What Richard didn't know was that I had a secret. 2 years ago, I'd started taking French lessons. It began innocently enough. My daughter was studying abroad in Paris, and I wanted to surprise her during my visit. But after she came home, I kept studying. There was something soothing about losing myself in conjugations and pronunciation drills after long days of being dismissed and overlooked. It was a space that was entirely mine. I wasn't fluent, but I was getting better. I could hold basic conversations, read newspapers, understand most of what I heard. I'd even started watching French news and listening to podcasts during my commute. I never mentioned it at work. Why would I? Richard had made it clear that my contributions weren't valued. What difference would one more skill make? The merger meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October. The Beaumont Industries executives were flying in from Lyon. Jean-Marc Beaumont, the CEO, and his chief financial officer, Margot Delacroix. Richard had been preparing for weeks, rehearsing his presentation, having his suit specially tailored, even hiring a pronunciation coach to practice saying Beaumont correctly. He made me book the conference room, order catering, prepare the presentation materials, coordinate with the lawyers. But when it came to the actual meeting, my role was clear. Sit quietly, take notes, smile when appropriate. Don't speak unless spoken to. I arrived early that morning, as I always did. The conference room was on the 23rd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. I arranged the materials, tested the projector, made sure the coffee was hot and the pastries were fresh. Richard arrived 15 minutes before the meeting, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He barely glanced at me. "Everything ready?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks. "Yes, the presentation is loaded. The contracts are printed and tabbed, and the catering just arrived." "Good. Remember, let me do the talking. If they ask you anything directly, keep it brief. This deal is too important to risk with unnecessary complications." I nodded, swallowing the familiar taste of humiliation. After 12 years, you'd think I'd be used to it. but it still stung. The Beaumont executives arrived precisely at 10. Jean-Marc Beaumont was in his mid-50s, silver-haired and distinguished in that effortless French way. Margot Delacroix was younger, maybe 40, sharp-eyed and all business. They shook hands with Richard, exchanged pleasantries in accented but excellent English, then noticed me sitting at the far end of the table. "And this is?" Jean-Marc asked politely. "Margaret, my assistant," Richard said smoothly. "She'll be taking notes." I wasn't his assistant. I was a senior manager. But I smiled and shook their hands without correcting him. The meeting began well enough. Richard presented our analysis of the American market, our proposed partnership structure, our projections for growth. He was polished and professional, I had to give him that. The French executives listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, nodded at the appropriate moments. Then Margot asked about client relations strategy. Specifically, how we would maintain Beaumont's reputation for customer service while scaling up in a new market. This was my area. I had prepared a detailed analysis, complete with case studies and implementation timelines. I'd given it to Richard 2 weeks ago. "Excellent question," Richard said. "We've developed a comprehensive strategy that leverages our existing client relationships while building new networks. The key is maintaining that personal touch while implementing scalable systems." He was reading nearly word for word from my report. I watched him take credit for my work, my ideas, my late nights and early mornings. The other team members wouldn't meet my eyes. After an hour, Richard suggested a break. The executives agreed, and Richard offered to show them the office. As they stood, Jean-Marc turned to Margot and said something in rapid French. She laughed and responded. I kept my head down, gathering papers, trying to disappear into the furniture as I'd learned to do. Richard led them toward the door. Then Jean-Marc paused and asked Richard something in French. I couldn't quite catch it, but Richard's face lit up. "You speak French?" Richard said in English, sounding delighted. "But of course," Jean-Marc replied, switching back to English. "And you?" "I studied it at Harvard," Richard said proudly. "Though I'm a bit rusty. Perhaps we could practice?" "That would be wonderful," Margot interjected. "Sometimes it's easier to discuss complex matters in one's native language." They switched to French as they walked out, and I heard Richard's somewhat halting but decent French mixing with their fluent responses. The door closed behind them. I sat alone in the conference room, staring at my notes. Of course Richard spoke French. Of course he did. Another advantage he'd never mentioned, probably because he'd never needed to. They returned 20 minutes later, and I noticed immediately that something had shifted. The atmosphere was more relaxed, almost friendly. Richard and the executives were chatting in French, laughing at some shared joke. "Margaret," Richard said, still in English, "could you bring us fresh coffee?" I stood to comply, but Jean-Marc raised his hand. "Please, there is no need. We are quite comfortable." They settled back into their seats, and I assumed they would return to English for the business portion. But they didn't. The conversation continued in French. At first, I thought they might switch back, but as minutes passed and they remained in French, I realized what was happening. They were excluding me deliberately, and Richard was allowing it, even encouraging it. I kept my pen moving across my notepad, pretending to take notes while my mind raced. Should I say something? Should I reveal that I understood every word? What would be the point? Richard would probably just be angry that I'd embarrassed him in front of the clients. So I stayed quiet and listened. They discussed the merger terms, the timeline, the financial structures, all topics I should have been part of, all conversations I should have been included in. Then Margot said something that made my blood run cold. "This partnership structure is excellent," she said in French. "Who developed it?" "I did," Richard replied in French, without hesitation. "It took months of research and analysis." "Impressive," Jean-Marc said. "And your team? Are they as capable?" Richard laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. "My team is adequate. They handle the administrative details while I focus on strategy." "And the woman?" Margot asked. "The one taking notes? She is?" "Margaret?" Richard's voice took on a dismissive tone that made my hands clench around my pen. "She's been with the company for years, competent enough for basic tasks, I suppose, but between you and me, she's really just here to make coffee and take minutes." I keep her around because she's reliable and doesn't complain. At her age, she's just grateful to have a job." They all laughed. Not malicious laughter, exactly. More like the casual amusement of people bonding over a shared understanding of workplace hierarchies. I felt my face burn, but I kept my eyes on my notepad, kept my pen moving, kept my breathing steady. At my age, just grateful to have a job. 12 years of loyalty, 12 years of excellence, 12 years of swallowing my pride and accepting less than I deserved. And this was what he really thought of me. "She has no family?" Margot asked. "She seems very dedicated." "Divorced," Richard said carelessly. "A daughter somewhere, I think. This job is basically her whole life. It's a bit sad, really, but useful for me. She'll work any hours I need without complaint because she has nothing else." My vision blurred. I blinked hard, forcing the tears back. I would not cry. Not here, not now. Jean-Marc said something about employee loyalty being valuable, and Richard agreed, then smoothly steered the conversation back to business matters. They continued in French for another 30 minutes, discussing contingency plans and potential obstacles, none of which I was supposed to understand. When they finally switched back to English, it was only to set a date for the next meeting and exchange polite goodbyes. The French executives shook Richard's hand warmly, complimented his French, and expressed enthusiasm about the partnership. Then they turned to me. "Thank you for your assistance," Jean-Marc said in careful English. I smiled politely. "Of course. It was a pleasure to meet you both." After they left, Richard was practically glowing. "That went perfectly," he said. "I think we've got this deal locked down. Good work on the prep, Margaret. Very helpful." "Very helpful. Like I was a stapler or a filing cabinet." "Thank you," I managed. "Take the rest of the day to write up the meeting notes," he said. "I want them on my desk first thing tomorrow. And make sure to emphasize my contributions to the partnership strategy. I want the board to see how I'm driving this company forward." He walked out whistling. I sat in that empty conference room for a long time, staring at my notes. At my age, just grateful to have a job, competent enough for basic tasks. Something inside me cracked. Not broke, exactly. More like shifted, rearranged itself into a different configuration. I pulled out my phone and did something I'd been too afraid to do for years. I updated my LinkedIn profile. I listed every project I'd actually worked on, every client relationship I'd built, every success I'd achieved. I removed the modest language and the careful hedging. I wrote it the way Richard would write his own profile: confident, accomplished, valuable. Then I started searching for jobs. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked harder than ever on the Beaumont partnership. But I also sent out applications. I took calls during my lunch breaks. I updated my resume to reflect my real contributions, not the diminished version Richard preferred. I also kept studying French. But now, I had a purpose beyond personal enrichment. The second meeting with Beaumont Industries was scheduled for 3 weeks later. This time, they were bringing their legal team, and we were bringing ours. The lawyers would be finalizing the contract terms, and Richard would be positioning himself to take credit for the entire deal. But I had made my own plans. 3 days before the meeting, I got a call from Morrison & Klein, a larger consulting firm across town. They'd seen my LinkedIn profile. They wanted to interview me for a director of client relations position. The pay was 40% higher than what I was currently making. The title actually matched my responsibilities. I took a personal day and went to the interview. I brought my portfolio, my track record, my references. I was honest about my situation at Henderson & Associates without being bitter or unprofessional. I simply presented the facts. I'd been doing senior-level work for years while being credited as an assistant. They offered me the job on the spot. I asked for 3 weeks to transition. They agreed. The second Beaumont meeting began much like the first. Richard, polished and confident. The French executives, professional and engaged. Me, quiet and note-taking at the end of the table. But this time, I had made my own preparations. The meeting proceeded in English for the first hour, covering contract details and legal terms. Then, during a break, the same pattern emerged. Jean-Marc and Margot began speaking French with Richard, switching seamlessly as if I didn't exist. And once again, they got comfortable. "The contract looks good," Margot said in French. But I have some concerns about the implementation team. Do they have the experience to manage this scale of partnership? Absolutely, Richard assured her in French. I'll be overseeing everything personally. And what about the client relations aspect? Jean-Marc asked. That's critical for our reputation. Handled, Richard said confidently. I've developed all the systems and strategies. My team just executes what I design. He was lying. He hadn't developed anything. Every system, every strategy, every client relationship protocol had been my work. This time, I didn't stay silent. Pardonnez-moi, I said clearly, in French. I couldn't help but overhear. The room went absolutely still. Richard's face drained of color. Jean-Marc and Margot looked surprised, then intrigued. I switched to English, keeping my voice professional and calm. I apologize for not mentioning earlier that I speak French. I didn't realize it would be relevant to our discussions. You speak French? Richard stammered. Yes, I said. I've been studying for 2 years. I'm not fluent, but I understand quite well. I turned to the Beaumont executives. May I switch to French? It might be easier to clarify a few points about the implementation strategy. Please, Jean-Marc said, his eyes bright with interest. I took a breath and continued in French. Mr. Henderson mentioned that he developed the client relations systems we'll be using for this partnership. I want to clarify that while he certainly provided leadership and vision, the actual development of those systems was a collaborative effort. It was the most diplomatic lie I'd ever told. In fact, I continued in French, I've been managing our client relations for the past 8 years. The systems we're proposing for Beaumont are based on protocols I developed while working with our international clients. If you have specific questions about implementation, I'd be happy to address them. Margot leaned forward, suddenly very focused. You developed the customer service protocols outlined in the proposal? Yes, I said. Along with the client retention strategies and the cultural adaptation framework, those were based on my work with our European and Asian clients over the past several years. I see, Jean-Marc said slowly. He glanced at Richard, whose jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. Mr. Henderson, Jean-Marc continued in French, perhaps you could clarify the division of responsibilities on this project. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. But to his credit, he recovered quickly. Margaret is absolutely right, he said smoothly in English. She's been instrumental in developing these systems. I should have been clearer about the collaborative nature of our work. It was the first time in 12 years he'd acknowledged my contributions in front of a client. The rest of the meeting had a different dynamic. Margot and Jean-Marc directed many of their questions to me in both French and English. They asked detailed questions about implementation, about cultural considerations, about specific scenarios I'd handled with other clients. I answered every question. Professionally, competently, demonstrating years of expertise that Richard had spent 12 years pretending didn't exist. After the French executives left, Richard didn't say a word to me. He just walked out of the conference room, his face tight with barely controlled fury. The next morning, I found an email waiting for me. Subject line, meeting request urgent. Richard wanted to see me in his office immediately. I printed out my resignation letter, slipped it into a folder, and walked upstairs. He was standing by his window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. He didn't turn around when I entered. You embarrassed me, he said quietly. I corrected a misunderstanding, I replied. You made me look like a liar in front of the most important clients this company has ever had. You made yourself look like a liar. I just spoke the truth. He finally turned around. His face was cold. You know what this means? Yes, I said. I do. I handed him the folder. This is my resignation. I'm giving you 3 weeks' notice, which should be enough time to transition the Beaumont partnership and my other accounts. He stared at the folder like it was a snake. You're resigning? I've accepted a position at Morrison & Klein, Director of Client Relations. I start in 3 weeks. His face cycled through shock, anger, and something that might have been panic. You can't do this. Not in the middle of the Beaumont deal. I can, and I am. But I'll make sure the transition is smooth. Despite everything, I care about this company and our clients. I'll promote you, he said suddenly. We can make you a VP. Increase your salary. Whatever you want. What I want, I said carefully, is to work somewhere I'm valued, somewhere my contributions are acknowledged, somewhere I'm not just grateful to have a job at my age." He had the grace to look ashamed. "You heard that." "I heard everything, Richard. Every dismissive comment, every lie, every time you took credit for my work." He sat down heavily in his chair. "The Beaumont executives called this morning. They want you to be the primary contact for the partnership. They said your expertise and cultural understanding are exactly what they need." "Then you should hire someone excellent to replace me," I said. 3 weeks should be enough time to find the right person." I turned to leave. "Margaret," he said, "I'm sorry. I truly am. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize because you never bothered to look," I said. "For 12 years, I made you successful. I made this company successful. And you treated me like furniture." I walked out. The next 3 weeks were strange. Suddenly, Richard was excessively polite. He invited me to meetings. He asked my opinion. He even sent a company-wide email acknowledging my contributions to the Beaumont partnership. It was too little. Too late. On my last day, the Beaumont executives sent a beautiful bouquet of flowers to my desk with a note in French. "To Margaret, with gratitude for your excellence and integrity. We look forward to working with you in your new role." Morrison and Klein had already reached out to them. My new company would be handling the European expansion phase of their American operations. Richard came to say goodbye. He looked older, somehow, diminished. "I hope you'll be happy there," he said. "I will be," I replied. And I was. At Morrison and Klein, I was given the respect I'd earned. My ideas were valued. My experience was acknowledged. I was paid what I was worth. 6 months later, I heard that Richard had lost 2 more senior team members. The company was struggling without the institutional knowledge that had walked out the door. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I was 60 years old, leading a team of talented professionals, managing partnerships across 3 continents, and using my French almost daily. My daughter visited from Paris and was amazed at how fluent I'd become. I bought a small condo overlooking the lake. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine. Sometimes I think about those years I spent making myself smaller, accepting less, staying quiet. I think about how I told myself it was practical, that I needed the job, that starting over was impossible at my age. I was wrong. The truth is, it's never too late to value yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to use your voice. My secret French lessons weren't just about learning a language. They were about reclaiming a part of myself that I'd allowed to be diminished. They were about investing in my own worth when no one else would. And when the moment came, when I heard the truth about how little I was valued, I had a choice. I could have stayed silent, swallowed the hurt, continued accepting less than I deserved. Instead, I spoke up. In French and in English. I claimed my expertise, my experience, my value. That choice changed everything. So, if you're reading this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're making yourself smaller to fit into someone else's expectations, if you're staying quiet because you're afraid or you think it's too late to change, hear me. It's not too late. Learn the skill, save the money, build the resume, document your work, know your worth. And when the moment comes, when you overhear the truth or face the choice or see the opportunity, speak up. Your secret skill might just be the key that unlocks your entire future. It was for me.